for you, but it's important to note that this is Air Force One. Just behind it, you see the plane of the South Korean leader landing there at Hamburg, Germany, a busy airfield. Air Force One is wheels down, so this is Air Force One that has landed now. And now we wait for the arrival ceremony that will come as the President and the First Lady walk down the steps. 4 o'clock there in Germany, and you think about it, the President has already had a very long day and a longer day to come throughout this. And we saw on his first foreign trip, at one point they said he was just exhausted after his time in the Middle East. And it seems as though they've built in a little bit more of pad to the schedule, a little bit ahead of schedule on this trip as opposed to the last trip.
Yeah, and it looks like tonight part of his schedule will also include a dinner that will involve the Prime Minister of Japan and the newly elected President of South Korea, of course, those very important allies in the conversation about what to do with North Korea. We've talked about the fact that the U.S. has planted a couple of anti-defense missile systems in South Korea. They have been welcomed, and yet this new president has kind of put a halt on some of the further installations that were going to go in, saying that he wanted to have an environmental analysis of how those things would work, while others say, listen, if there's no South Korea, the environmental part of it doesn't really matter. So we can imagine they're going to continue some of those conversations tonight as well.
Yeah, and the South Koreans seem to have become a little bit more hawkish after the ICBM test. That seems to have been a change. We saw that North Korean-American joint military exercise of launching their own rocket systems, video of that coming out, joint statement from the South Koreans and the Americans. But there's the juxtaposition again, the president having that sort of friendly dinner with Japan and South Korea going, what do we do? And then he has got the Chinese president and the Russian president for perhaps some arm twisting. And then the question comes, what concessions do the Chinese and the Chinese and Russians want from the United States to help with North Korea? And how does that impact President Trump's domestic policy? Does China say, well, you've been really tough on us about trade, back off on trade with us and we'll help you with North Korea?
We'll see if they
what deal do you have to make
that deal. Okay, so as we await the President and First Lady actually deplaning here in Hamburg, Germany, let's bring in Brett Baer, host of Special Report. Brett, you saw the speech, I imagine, this morning, and a lot of folks say, listen, when he stays on that script, it was very presidential in nature. So what was your take of the speech?
Well, listen, there are two sides to this trip, right? In Poland, the speech itself, which was very powerful, very well delivered, echoed the character and the history of Poland to make a statement about the will to fight terrorists, using the past of Poland fighting the Nazis and the Soviets. And it was powerful in the images in that speech. And I think the messages about Russia stepping away, saying they need to get away from the dictators of Syria and Iran, saying that he would reaffirm and the U.S. stands behind Article 5, all hitting these marks in this speech, the 3 Cs, all these countries that are surrounded by 3 Cs of Eastern Europe that are so crucial, really, to the way the U.S. looks at that region in a geopolitical sense going forward. That's the one side, which was, for the most part, all positive. Then there's the other side, is the news conference, and that is what is being focused on. The answer about, well, I think it was Russia that interfered, but it could have been other countries, other people. Not a definitive sense, as you see the President and the First Lady about ready to exit Air Force One. And then, you know, ripping on CNN and the media. Obviously, there's a back and forth there, and he has a right to be upset about certain stories. But when overseas, I think Doug mentioned it earlier, it's an interesting take for a president to answer the way he's answered in front of the Polish leader. But this is a different kind of president who answers questions like he answers them. But it's two sides of President Trump's trip to Poland.
Absolutely. And he did take the opportunity when he was asked again about, was it Russia? Will you definitively say that it was meddling, to bring up President Obama's name and to say, again, if he knew in August before the election, why didn't he do something more? He said, people will claim that he choked. President Trump says, I don't think he choked. I think he thought Hillary Clinton was going to win. And they essentially didn't want to mar that. They didn't think I was going to win. So, again, reopening that conversation as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's a disconnect there, Shannon. I mean, ripping on the former President Obama for not acting on the CIA's warning about Russia interfering in the election, and then not saying definitively that Russia interfered in the election. I mean, there's a disconnect there. So there you have it, ripping on a former president, the media, and also, you know, talking about, as he talked about in that press conference, what he's dealing with at home. I think there are people that look at this and say, this is a different president, but the guy who delivered that speech with that message that was so powerful, I think is the one that obviously the Polish people will look back to and say, this was a big moment.
Yeah, and they literally are rolling out the red carpet. We use that phrase at times. We're actually watching them do that as we await him deplaning from Air Force One. You mentioned several things that he hit on with regard to NATO, with Russia, with the threat from terrorism. And it did boil down to that overall theme that we kept hearing about. He said the fundamental question is, does the West have the will to survive, to protect our borders, to preserve civilization in the face of those who would subvert and try to destroy it? I mean, it was a very, very big theme, a big speech, calling basically on Western civilization to fight for its own survival.
Yeah, and he talked about the threats from ISIS. In the press conference, he talked about the threat from North Korea and severe consequences to come. There are a lot of things on this president's plate, and as we get ready for this G20, these meetings could not be more consequential. The meeting with President Putin, the meeting with Chinese President Xi, the way forward for North Korea is obviously the most pressing issue he has. So taking time, again, in that press conference to talk about the American intelligence community, how it's dropped the ball before, to talk about all of these things, I think you'll see a refocus in this G20 about the real threats that the U.S. is facing.
Brett, Leland here. As we watch the president walk off Air Force One, he's coming from that really warm and positive reception in Poland into some pretty significant headwinds dealing with the president of Russia and the president of China. Give us a sense of what are your folks saying are the deliverables for this president? What's their strategy walking in? What do they want out of Russia and China? What are they willing to give up to get those things?
I think that's a great question, Leland, and we don't know the answer. As you see the First Lady and the President exit Air Force One there in Hamburg, Germany, we don't know the answer to that. I think there's been a disappointment inside the White House about the interaction with China when it comes to North Korea. You've heard some of that from President Trump, speaking in speeches and obviously his tweets. And I think as far as Russia goes, yes, North Korea is going to be a big issue, but Syria will be really the biggest issue. And Secretary of State Rex Tillerson has said that the president is ready to talk about a negotiated solution to Syria that perhaps gets Assad out and sets up some government. I think that that'll be fascinating to see on Syria. What does Russia want? Probably a pledge not to install more sanctions. And judging by the answer at that press conference, I don't think you're going to see this president really press President Putin on the election interference, but we'll see.
So when you said that the White House may not at least be communicating what their strategic vision is that a departure from the time of the Obama administration and the Bush administration? Did they walk into these meetings with a lot clearer strategic visions, or is it always this sort of give and take, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, obviously this president is a deal maker, and I think they know what they want going in. I think they don't talk about it as much as perhaps other administrations did, laying the groundwork for what they expect. I think they realize that having dealt with the Chinese president before, and having talked with, on the phone at least, the Russian president, knowing he's a former KGB agent, knowing that he comes prepared to all of these meetings, they're going to wait and see what they can get out of it. Again, number one, North Korea. Number two, Syria. And coming off what was really a successful speech and delivery and tone and message in Poland, we'll see how this G20 lays out.
But do you think that Secretary Tillerson in any way is kind of underplaying expectations going into this, saying, listen, the most important thing is just for these two guys to have a good interchange? You know, the president's going to do what he wants to do. We know about essentially the dossier that is prepared for the president, a psychological workup of President Putin. As you said, as a former KGB agent himself, we know he is meticulous, we're told, about studying his opponents, about showing up at the meetings with a very specific agenda. All of that has been prepared for this president, but as we've said repeatedly, he does things his own way. He trusts his gut, and in many occasions, it works for him. So do you think that Secretary Tillerson is sort of downplaying expectations on purpose?
Well, you don't know what's happening behind the scenes. I know that Secretaries Mattis and Tillerson talk almost every day about what the strategic goals are, along with the National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, as you see the President boarding Marine One there. I do think that you're going to see a question here. Are we going to see the President Trump who likes to be liked in these meetings, or are we going to see the President Trump who likes to be feared in these meetings? And there are two different messages there. I don't know how this interaction is going to go. One would guess that both sides are going to try to come out with some success, some tangible success that is tweetable, that is they can talk about, and they can leave the meeting, both of them, with a success. I think there will be a lot of critics of this administration who look at the meeting with Putin and say, if there was not a mention of the interference in the 2016 election, that is a signal of some capitulation of some kind. But the bar is low. He could talk a little bit about that and spend a lot of time on Syria and North Korea.
Well, essentially, as you said there, Brett, there's been criticism that if he doesn't bring up the meddling in the election, Adam Schiff, the ranking Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, said essentially it sends a horrible message to Russia that they can walk all over us and get away with it. Do you think, not that the president's going to take advice from Congressman Adam Schiff, but do you think he's going to feel the pressure to at least, as you said, get in a mention of that? I mean, we'll only know when we get the readouts from these two parties, and it's always interesting to get them from both sides and compare them then and see how the two different sides view the meeting.
Well, I think after spending in this press conference a lot of time ripping on former President Obama for not acting on the CIA's warnings about Russia and its activities trying to meddle in the election, I think that there will be some self-pressure, perhaps, after talking about it that much, that there will have to be something. But we don't know. I think that his answer today confused some people. Others looked at it and said, you know, he wants to move on from this whole Russia investigation. But the bottom line is that Russia, no matter where you go with the investigation, Russia did try to interfere in the election. And that is what all of his people say. Director Pompeo, who's his CIA director, says that there is no doubt that Russia interfered. Did it affect votes? Did it directly change votes? No, there's no evidence of that. But there is evidence that Russia affected, or tried to attack our sovereignty, our democracy, our way of voting for a president. So I think that will be a major issue that people will be looking at in this meeting.
Brett, going back real quickly to the issue of North Korea and dealing with the Chinese and the Russians about that, does the White House feel as though they learned anything out of the Chinese visit to Mar-a-Lago, where, to your point, they had tweetable deliverables coming out of that meeting, and even the Chinese press were talking about President Trump as somebody to be taken in his word, which was seen as a veiled warning to the North Koreans. And now, just a couple of months later, we have the president saying, well, I counted on the Chinese and they didn't come through. How sad is that? Have they changed their strategy a little bit, you think?
I do. I mean, I think there was a disappointment inside the White House about China and what has not transpired as far as the pressure on North Korea. And I think some of the messaging you're hearing from people like the UN ambassador, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, that any country that is helping North Korea is therefore hurting their chances for increased trade with the U.S. is a direct warning to China and to other countries. So I think their strategy will change here, and they're going to try to put the leverage more in a different position and not the friendly chit-chat over chocolate cake in Mar-a-Lago.
Well, yeah, you brought up that issue of sort of, is this the president who wants to be liked or the president who wants to be feared in these meetings when he comes away? The Marine One's now taxied out, looking back at Air Force One, Shannon.
It is, as those important meetings come into view. Brett, you mentioned Ambassador Haley at the UN. She did have some really tough talk yesterday, saying to essentially China and Russia that they were, quote, holding the hands of North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un. And she seems to be one of the more vocal members of this administration, maybe getting to play a little bit of the bad cop while others get to play good cop. She's not mincing words there, though, at the UN.
No, and, you know, you sit there in front of the UN Security Council, which, by the way, this month is chaired by China, and you are directly dealing with their representatives, looking them in the eye and saying, point blank, this is where the U.S. stands. I think that those messages were echoed today by President Trump, who forecast severe consequences. What those look like, I think we don't know. And as you talked about with General Keane earlier, the military options are not pleasant. Russia and China don't believe that there is a viable military option. But I'll tell you this, in the Pentagon, there are many military options that have been laid out on the table for this president.
Yeah, they're certainly thinking about him. Brett, thanks so much. We'll obviously a lot of coverage coming up on Special Report tonight of this.
You got it.
We will see you at 6 p.m. In the meantime, President Trump getting ready for an historic meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. So what is at stake? We've discussed some of that. What can he really, though, hope to achieve on fighting fighting ISIS? We'll talk about that coming up.
927-2400.
President Trump arriving just moments ago in Hamburg, Germany for the G20 summit. This ahead of his first ever meeting face-to-face with Vladimir Putin. Joined now by John Bolton, former U.S. ambassador to the UN, senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a Fox News contributor. Ambassador, good morning to you, sir.
Good morning.
What do you make heading into this meeting? Because I want to play a little bit of what the president had to say in his speech in Warsaw, actually publicly calling out Russia. Here's what he said.
We're working with Poland in response to Russia's actions and destabilizing behavior. And we're grateful for the example Poland has set for every member of the NATO alliance by being one of the few nations that actually meets its financial obligations.
That was before his speech in Warsaw, but he went even further in the speech in Warsaw, accusing them of destabilizing and trying to meddle all around the world. So how do you think this meeting goes?
Well, I don't think the meeting ought to be one that they try and reach specific decisions on individual issues. I think this should be a get-acquainted meeting. I think it's particularly important for a president with Donald Trump's style, very personal in many respects, to be able to take Putin's measure. I think he'll do fine in the meeting. I note with some concern the leaks out of the White House in the New York Times this morning saying the president's own staff is worried about this meeting. They want to structure it because they don't trust him to be able to handle it. So I think actually he'll do fine is my guess. What he really needs to do is get these leaks under control.
How does he do that?
Well, I think he's got to fire some people, and he ought to do the best job he can to figure out who's doing the leaks and fire them. And he may get the wrong person, but I think firing somebody at this point is very critical.
Yes, it was interesting. I think we probably read the same article where they talked about that they wanted to kind of essentially micromanage him a little bit on this meeting, and they wanted him to be very well prepared.
Yeah, you can't trust this guy alone with Putin. We, the pros from Dover, can structure him. I mean, if I were the president, I would be looking down the list of people engaged in preparation for that meeting with Putin and deciding who was going to see the door.
All right, so I want to make sure we hit on North Korea while we've got you, because there's been a lot of talk about it. We know there's going to be more talk at the G20, the president sitting down not only with Putin, but with leaders of China and South Korea and Japan and everybody who you would think has a stake in this. He's tried. Now he's publicly cajoled them with tweets. Where does that conversation go this weekend?
Well, I think he's indicated he's looking at some very tough options. Trump has a bad hand dealt to him after 25 years of failure in the Clinton administration, failure in the Bush administration, failure in the Obama administration, all based on the same policy, that North Korea could be negotiated out of its nuclear weapons program through diplomacy and sanctions. Failed for 25 years. So that's why his options are so limited. I think he needs to push China, and it won't be easy, to acknowledge that everybody's better off with a reunited Korea. That's the way to end North Korea's nuclear program. We will not change North Korea's behavior. We won't change it by sanctioning North Korea. We won't change it by trying to sanction China.
Well, so far that has been unsuccessful. Ambassador, thank you very much. Good to see you.
Thank you.
United Airlines in the friendly skies facing another PR nightmare, this time over a mother allegedly forced to hold her 2-year-old in her lap for nearly 4 hours, even though she bought a ticket for $1,000. Seems like United Airlines just cannot catch a break. They are dealing with another in-flight controversy after giving away a seat that was reserved for a 2-year-old passenger, and it got worse from there. William Longinus with the story from Los Angeles. So deja vu all over again. What happened this time?
2 more failing grades for United, one for reselling the same seat, and the second for the manner in which it treated the passenger who brought this failure to their attention. So Hawaii school teacher Shirley Yamauchi bought 2 tickets for an 18-hour flight from Hawaii to Boston months in advance, paying almost $1,000 for each seat, one for herself, another for her 2-year-old son, as required. Now, on the final leg of the flight in Houston, the flight attendant asked if her child was on the plane. Clearly, you can see he was in the seat next to her, and she had proof with a boarding pass. The flight attendant said the seat had been resold to a standby passenger for $75. She complained but complied, holding the 25-pound kid for a 3-hour flight. Quote, I was very uncomfortable. My hand, my left arm was smashed up against the wall. I lost feeling in my legs and arm. I started remembering all those incidents with United, the violence, the teeth getting knocked out. I'm Asian. I didn't want those things to happen to me. The United spokesman says a gate agent inaccurately scanned her son's boarding pass, so it resold his seat. Working to prevent this from happening again, said United. Sound familiar? Well, back in April, United issued new rules saying customers seated on the plane would not be required to give up their seat involuntarily, and 2, employees had the power to resolve things on the spot. Clearly, Leland, somebody did not get the memo. 5 days later, they apologized, refunded 1 ticket, and gave her a travel voucher.
Well, at least they have apologized a little bit quicker this time. So we'll see if we get anything more out of this. William Longinus, thanks so much.
President Trump arriving just moments ago in Hamburg for the G20 summit after getting a rock star welcome in Poland earlier this morning. But now the spotlight is on his upcoming one-on-one meeting with Vladimir Putin. Will he address allegations of Russian election meddling? A fair and balanced debate next.
Supported in that victory over communism by a strong alliance of free nations in the West that defied tyranny. Now among the most committed members of the NATO alliance, Poland has resumed its place as a leading nation of a Europe that is strong, whole, and free. A strong Poland is a blessing to the nations of Europe, and they know that. A strong Europe is a blessing to the West and to the world.
President Trump praising Poland and vowing to confront new forms of aggression against the West, calling out Russia. But as Brett Baer pointed out, stopping short of condemning Moscow for meddling in the U.S. election, instead putting the focus on President Obama.
Barack Obama, when he was president, found out about this in terms of if it were Russia, found out about it in August. Now, the election was in November. That's a lot of time. He did nothing about it. Why did he do nothing about it? He was told it was Russia by the CIA. That's the real question, is why did he do nothing from August all the way to November 8th?
Lisa Booth, Fox News contributor to the Washington Examiner, president and founder of High Noon Strategies. Also Jessica Tarlov, Democratic strategist, senior director of research for Bustle.com, and a Fox News contributor. Ladies, nice to see you.
Hi, Leland.
Good to have you. All right, Jessica, first to you. Some July quarterbacking after the election.
Yeah.
Do you agree with President Trump? Should President Obama have done something?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know any Democrat who isn't sitting there wondering, why did you choke on this information, to use the terms the administration used themselves when this happened? I would say, though, that it's all well and good for Donald Trump to be talking about this, and it's an important conversation to have. But he also then went back on it in that press conference and said, oh, we don't really know if it was Russia, and claimed that the media had to backtrack on the information that 17 intelligence agencies had confirmed that it was Russia that was meddling. He can't have it both ways. There's legitimate criticism to be made of President Obama about this, but you need to be consistent, and he just isn't again.
Lisa, is it worth it for the president to continue the inconsistency as Jessica talks about it? Maybe it was Russia, maybe it wasn't. It could have been other people, rather than just coming out and calling it the way so many people say it is?
Yeah, I mean, I think you could just call Russia out on it. But look, I do think it's a fair question to ask why President Obama didn't do anything when he had the information. And there's been reports in other outlets that the Obama administration said it was because President Obama thought that Hillary Clinton would end up winning the election, because it wasn't until after President Trump won that President Obama called for the intelligence agencies to do the review and then also put sanctions on Russia. And I also think if you're President Trump, he's looking back at the last administration and saying, hey, wait a minute, do you guys all remember that President Obama was incredibly weak on Russia? Because what did he do? Reset relations by pulling out of a missile defense agreement with Poland and the Czech Republic on the 70th anniversary of Soviet's invasion into Poland. Laugh at Romney when he said that Russia was our #1 geopolitical foe. Do nothing when Russia invaded Ukraine, telling the then Russian president that he would have more flexibility after the election. So I think President Trump is sort of revisiting that and letting all these people who've been attacking him on the issue of Russia remembering what President Obama did not do.
Why do we need to constantly revisit? I mean, Republicans get on Democrats every single time we mention the name George Bush. When we say, oh, the recession we inherited, you explode. We've talked about it, Lisa, before. You know, oh, healthcare was worse before Obamacare. President Trump won this election. Own it. You are the most powerful man in the entire world, and you're standing up there on a podium in Poland after having given a great speech where you finally reaffirmed our commitment to Article 5, and you're ranting about
Russia the day before the meeting.
Fake news, Lisa.
Jessica.
CNN.
Hold on, ladies. Let's just 1 second. Let's hear from Jason Chaffetz. You barely need me here. We'll hear from Jason Chaffetz and get your thoughts.
I think the president is spot on. One thing that came out from the Homeland Security Secretary, Jay Johnson, in questioning from Trey Gowdy is once Homeland Security did know about it and they did ask the DNC or the DCCC, the Democratic organization, they wouldn't cooperate. And that really begs a question of how hard did they press it? What did they do? What did they not do? It's a Democratic administration. It really begs a lot of questions.
And Lisa, this brings up another question. It's to what you were saying earlier about President Trump reminding everybody about how weak President Obama was on Russia. Republicans agree about that. But if you continue to remind everybody how weak President Obama was as President Trump, doesn't that force his hand for people to start saying, okay, President Trump, what are you going to do? How are you going to be strong against Russia? Something so far we have not seen in any way.
That's not true. I mean, he thumbed his nose at Russia today in Poland, also announcing the selling of the Patriot missile defense system to Poland. He also went after or attacked in Syria, something that President Obama never did. He actually deferred to Russia in sort of, negotiations and allowing Russia to increase its presence in Syria. Also, we're looking to increase our military spending, increase domestic energy production, which hurts Russia as well. Also reaffirming our commitment to NATO today as well, thumbing his nose at Putin the day before the meeting. And also even just his act in Syria as well. Russia said they would retaliate. Well, where's the retaliation? So I actually don't agree with you on that. I think he has stood up to Putin in ways that we didn't see President Obama, who Putin also saw as incredibly weak. And all of Americans thought they were weak.
I've got to give Jessica like the last 10 seconds.
Yeah, no, just two things there. I think that a lot of what you said is true. I would point out that he did go to that preference. Okay, great. Morning unity, Lisa. He went to that press conference and then said, we don't know who meddled. That is not thumbing your nose at Russia. He also didn't call them out explicitly for what they've been doing in Ukraine, which is a tremendous problem.
Actually, in his speech, he did say a little bit about...
No, he talked about destabilizing the region. He did not say, you illegally annexed Crimea. We will not stand for this.
Okay.
I mean...
Well, that is a distinction you make. Lisa, Jessica, appreciate it, guys. Thanks so much, ladies.
Thank you.
All right.
A Fox News alert now and an update on the condition of Congressman Steve Scalise. He's been downgraded to serious condition, sent back to intensive care after contracting an infection. Garrett Tenney is live in Washington to give us some more details. Hi, Garrett.
Hey, Shannon, doctors have told us that gunshot to the hip caused extensive damage to Steve Scalise, blood vessels and internal organs, but that it also left hundreds of bullet fragments inside his body. He has already undergone a number of surgeries over the last few weeks, and he had been improving. But in a statement last night, the hospital says, quote, Congressman Steve Scalise has been readmitted to the intensive care unit at MedStar Washington Hospital Center due to new concerns for infection. His condition is listed as serious. Sources close to the congressman tell us that this isn't all that much of a surprise, though, given the extent of his injuries. Doctors had always expected an infection would develop at some point, and they have really said from the start that his recovery would have ups and downs. At a press conference 3 weeks ago, the doctors did say that they fully expect Scalise will be able to walk and hopefully to run again, but we're expecting to get a more complete update on the latest with his condition later today. Shannon?
All right, Garrett Tenney, thank you very much.
Got it.
And now to a little domestic policy. They're still doing stuff on Capitol Hill, and Republicans are facing pressure to reach a deal on health care reform. And now there is a new idea from Texas Senator Ted Cruz, and it is gaining some traction with conservatives. The Senate back in session coming up on Monday. So could this be the answer they're looking for?
And the third time is the charm for SpaceX, a successful launch after a couple of stops and starts. Details on the mission and the attention it's getting from the Trump administration.
By a tennis player at Wimbledon, Daniel Medvedev of Russia took out his wallet and then started tossing coins at the umpire chair. You can sort of hear the chuckles from the crowd. The official apparently made some controversial calls during the match, but Medvedev says he was simply upset at losing his match and wasn't sending a message. He apologized, and maybe he should pick up those coins because evidently he faces a hefty fine for his behavior.
Well, a proposal from Texas Senator Ted Cruz could breathe new life into Republican efforts to reform health care. Here's his idea: to allow health insurers that do sell plans up to the Obamacare regulations to also sell cheaper, less comprehensive plans at the same time. It's an idea that's gaining traction among conservatives. Joining me now to talk about it, Dan Henninger, deputy editorial page editor for the Wall Street Journal. Good to see you today.
See you, Shannon.
Okay, so we know that has a lot of interest from conservatives who say essentially there was kind of a similar deal made in the House, these state waivers, so you can allow people to have more competitive plans by different prices. You know, the critics immediately say those with pre-existing conditions and other real health concerns are going to pay a lot more, or they argue not be able to have access at all.
Yeah, I know that is the criticism, that you have a big adverse selection problem here. All the people who are healthy, like kids in their 20s, will take Ted Cruz's plan, and everybody else will sweep into the Obamacare plans. The premiums will rise. You know, you could sit here for half an hour talking about the substance of this bill, but I think at the moment it's all about the politics and trying to get to 50 votes in the Senate. And how do you hold the conservatives together and not lose, you know, Susan Collins, one of the other moderates, to pull it down below 50 votes? And at the moment, this looks like the piece of legislation, the Ted Cruz proposal, that is going to get it done. It's very similar to what Congressman MacArthur proposed in the House that got it through over there, which is allow the opt-out waivers for the governor, for people in the states. And I think Mike Lee has kind of put his finger on what they're trying, Senator Mike Lee. They just don't want to leave Obamacare in place, and they want to have some mechanism for people to opt out of it and to create alternatives. That is the long-term goal here. And if they can build towards that with the Cruz option, maybe it's worth looking at.
It sounds like Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has actually sent this thing over to the CBO for some scoring to look at it, because that's critical because of so many things about doing reconciliation, and you've got the parliamentarian that's going to rule on things too. But it sounds like he's taking the concept seriously to take that step.
Well, Mitch McConnell is trying to get to the goal line, and if this is going to help them, then he's going to send it over to the CBO. I myself have always felt that the Republicans get too intimidated by these CBO scores, that they should understand, as I was suggesting, that what they're trying to do is not fix Obamacare in one piece of legislation. That is never going to happen. It's going to take years. I mean, this was an extraordinarily complex piece of legislation. It's permeated the American healthcare system and the individual market. It's going to take a lot of work, mainly done by governors in the states, to structure a program that works. So they should not allow the CBO to say, what you're doing is off the table. I think they should have more courage.
Well, and the thing is, too, we've seen over and over again how those CBO scores did not pan out with reality. I mean, they were wildly off with some of the Obamacare predictions, so that's just a fact. You've written a very interesting piece in which you talk about Medicaid, because that is at the heart of so many of these dust-ups in the Senate about whether they can get something done. And people want to feel like in some cases it's free money. And once you have more and more people on a program that was meant to help the poor and disabled, it's hard to scale those things back once people depend on them.
Yeah. I wrote that I think the shrewdest thing that the designers of Obamacare did was to insert into the bill an expansion of Medicaid to the states for the new people coming into the program, and the federal government would pay them for the first several years 100% of the cost. Now, Medicaid has been a problem for years with the states. They sort of made a Faustian bargain with the government when it began, which is that they basically split the cost 50-50, except that as Medicaid populations rise in the states, the federal government continues to pay a half or more of the share. As a result, Medicaid costs are crushing the states. They're the second biggest outlay next to K through 12 education. And one of the things they do to try to control it is to cut back money to providers, which is to say doctors trying to serve the Medicaid population. So when the Obamacare provision offered them 100% payment, 13 Republican governors took it. And they've been getting a lot of money. Ohio has gotten $3.4 billion. Arkansas has gotten $1.4 billion. And now those Republican governors are really loath to do anything to cut back on Medicaid outlays, which is what the bill ultimately wants to do.
This is the one who says we have to have difficult conversations about government spending and entitlements. They're the ones who are preaching that sermon.
Well, you know, it's like the iron law of politics. Offer them money and they will come. And these governors were in such desperate straits with Medicaid, they took that money and now they don't want to give it back. And they've got their senators, some of the moderate senators, saying, your bill does too much to hurt Medicaid, to pull down Medicaid spending. So the Obama people knew what they were doing when they put that in, because they knew once you got committed to an entitlement like this, it's very hard to roll it back. So it's going to take some courage by the Republicans to explain to people Medicaid is just not like private medicine. It's lowest common denominator medicine. It's not the best medicine out there, and they're trying to reform it, as, for instance, Scott Walker is trying to do in Wisconsin right now.
Yeah, and it's often hard to find a provider that will take it.
Very.
We know that. All right, Dan, thank you very much. Thoughtful piece. Good to see you. Leland?
Well, third time's a charm for SpaceX. The private space firm gets a satellite off the ground following, well, some technical glitches. But NASA says that it's hoping some positive news later today from Vice President Mike Pence might put a shot in the arm to the space program. We are live from the Kennedy Space Center. Coming up next.
DM, Russian interference in the 2016 election, and the president's ongoing feud with media. This is all as we await the first face-to-face meeting of President Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin, all ahead, happening now.
A disturbing truck accident on a Pennsylvania highway. The whole thing caught on camera. Whoa, motorists behind the big rig were shooting video when the driver lost control and flipped over. They say The truck had been swerving for several minutes before this wreck. It all happened Monday on I-476 just west of Philly. Good Samaritans swarmed the cab, pulled the driver out. Troopers say he'll be okay. They're investigating if he was too exhausted to drive. The interstate was shut down for several hours.
Right now, Vice President Mike Pence is on his way to visit the Kennedy Space Center just hours after the private company SpaceX launched another satellite into space. NASA hoping for a boost from the Trump administration. Phil Keating live from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Well, big building behind you, Phil, and that's not the only symbolism there, right?
Right, that's the Vehicle Operations Building, where inside around 1 o'clock today, Vice President Pence will speak to about 1,000 NASA private as well as civil servants that work here on the campus. But the symbolism really starts with Air Force 2. As it flies in, it's going to land on the same historic landing strip once used by the space shuttle fleet. And today's really all about igniting and inspiring our future engineers, rocket scientists, and astronauts, and better coordinating all space operations between the military, civil, and commercial. Speaking of commercial, that SpaceX launched last night, which was quite nice to watch right before sunset. It deployed that 15,000-pound Intelsat satellite about 32 minutes into the flight. No rocket landing this time. That's because it went to geosynchronous orbit and there was not enough fuel on that rocket to get back down onto the drone ship. Now, the president's relaunching of the National Space Council with Friday's executive order, surrounded by astronauts, including Apollo 11 legend Buzz Aldrin, also aims to recharge American-driven space exploration and innovation, just as the National Space Council did back in the 1960s, eventually putting human footprints on the moon.
We're going to lead again. It's been a long time. It's over 25 years. And we're opening up, and we are going.
Everybody with those upright rocket landings, and they have this year finally proven that reusing rockets and even capsules